begin the story, we must first start with a history lesson. Now, when I was in school, my least favorite subject was history. I was like, that was then, this is now, so why in the world do we have to know this stuff? But you know, there's a saying, in order to know where you're going, you must first know where you're coming. So now, we won't be going back to the beginning of time, you know, with Adam and Eve. But we will be going back in time to wherein there were no cell phones. Yeah. No telephones, no social media, no TVs, no cars, no buildings or highways or byways or concrete or pavement. No, but a time when black lives should have mattered. They should have mattered then, like they should be mattered now. Past, present, and future. So take this journey with us and hear our story that includes a gentle conversation about history, the census, slavery, the war, and freedom. Look where he brought me from.
You might be wondering who the target audience for this episode of the documentary would be.
The documentary will be airing in February 2022, which is designated as Black History Month. The researcher of this project does not believe that February should primarily highlight the contributions of famous or well-known people who contributed to the lives of African Americans in this county. Because for many, the fight is daily, as they continue to be challenged with the expectations to do more, just because of the color of their skin. Therefore, Americans should also highlight and honor everyday individuals, like those in the families, and the communities of those who have contributed to the advance of African Americans in this country. Reflecting on their heritage and accomplishments gives us the opportunity to honor those who've come before us, who fought for their rights, even when they were brought to this country as enslaved human beings, while at the same time, acknowledging that today, in their own way, they are still fighting for equality or civility.
There is a movement especially amongst African Americans who desire to find out more about their ancestral heritage and have taken a DNA tests, are doing genealogy research, and are spending countless number of hours trying to define their family's story. It has been more than 10 years since the researcher of this project completed her DNA test on Ancestry when it was in the beta or introductory phase. Today, you will see she is not only of African descent, but she is part Scottish, Swedish and of English descent as well. So, now what is family history? It is the historical account of your family from one generation to the next. Mrs. Brown searched the internet looking for a photo that could represent as many generations in one photo. Then she remembered, she was able to capture 4 generations of her family from her daughter, to her grandmother, who was her daughter's great-grandmother. This can be a rare gem to have, because families tend to focus on the relationship with their grandparents. But her daughter was blessed to have a relationship with her great-grandmother for 32 years. 10 generations and 62 great-grandparents who were African American and biracial, all born as far back as the 1790s and here in America. So you're gonna want to call the family together. You know, just like in the backstory.
But this time, get a pen and paper and be prepared to take notes as you take this journey to learn how she was able to identify many of her lost ancestors as well as many new family members.
That's why this episode of Look Where He Brought Me From is dedicated to understanding the work that is needed in order for you to be prepared when doing family history research for your African American family.
The episodes that are a part of this documentary will be presented in 3 parts. The video in Zone 1 was the backstory, which was released on Thanksgiving Day 2021. The premiere, which is Zone 2, will be aired in February 2022, and Zone 3, which address the challenges you will face, is also airing during Black History Month, February 2022. Within the 3 research zones are suggestions on how to record and gather and locate the information that will support the oral accounts that have been shared with you, your family. Zone 1, the Friends and Family Zone. If you start today, and research back to the year 1900, because many of your elders are still alive, like your great-aunts, grandparents, and even their friends and acquaintances, you will have a better chance of gathering important information that will help you in your journey today and later on. Be sure to take great notes. For Zone 2, you'll need your notes from Zone 1 to find information. The first place to start is by using the 1870 to 1940 census and other records to confirm information, birth, death, marriage, and even social security information. There are many sources available to help you in your quest to confirm the oral history that has been shared with you. Don't forget military records, state archives, local genealogy groups, and even hospital and newspapers can help you put the pieces of the story together. Zone 3 can be the hardest and the worst to navigate, because the records that record your family's history are documented in the information about the slaveholder, their family, friends, and neighbors, who at that time considered humans as property for their financial gain and gratification. Now, we all know, it is what it is, but there's no other for the researcher to tell it like it is, other standing on the word of truth. This episode is dedicated to highlighting the challenges you will face finding your ancestors in the EBS and weaves of the slaveholders' documentation for Zone 3. So buckle up, and get ready. North America, or America, is a melting pot of many nationalities that come together: black, white, brown, all shades and mixtures of racial orientations that make America what it is, a great land of opportunities. To set the tone, today in 2022, America is still viewed as the greatest country in the free world, the land of the free and the home of the brave. 8 out of 10 of these nationalities who migrated here from another country can trace their lineage back to 16 or even the 1500s because the ancestors from these nationalities chose to be here. However, for the 10 to 12 million African Americans whose ancestors once lived in communities where faith, traditions, and families meant the world to their way of life, who found themselves ripped away from their native land in Africa, to be brought to America by brute force through the transatlantic slave trade, which occurred from the 16th century or 1480s to the 19th century, until 1865, to serve others. For their descendants who survived to finally find themselves emancipated in 1865. Then worked to change their socio-economic outcome in hopes for a better day for their descendants. In 2022, still find the playing field, and the bar for equal opportunities in all things, is still raised higher for them than their peers. And continually stolen on a daily basis. As they are judged by what they wear, how they speak, or where they do or don't live, just because of the color of their skin. Yeah, the things that make us go wow. There are many challenges that exist today which contribute to the issues that the researcher's ability to find and identify their lost ancestors. Let's take a look at some of them. In the 1977, the saga of an African American family titled Roots aired, and for 7 days, the nation was capsized in hearing the story of how one man took the oral accounts shared from one generation to another and researched until he found his way back to Africa. One of the scenes that stuck with the researcher over the years was when Toby, portrayed by LeVar Burton, told Fiddler, portrayed by Louis Gossett Jr., that Fiddler had been a slave so long, he didn't know who he really was. Even as a child, that resonated with her, because she knew she wanted to understand what he meant by that statement. Exactly how long had slaves been here in America, to where they assimilated, and forgot where they came from? How could they forget their roots? Let's take a look at the 2 types of challenges, both internal or personal, and external or documentation. The internal, or personal challenges, are where your elders feel embarrassed and ashamed of their past. Even though you don't have a clue why this embarrassment exists, you have to approach their truths with compassion and empathy, because it's in these stories, and the account of their lives, where your clues exist. persevere with patience. The researcher's family hated she was trying to learn what she could, so they pushed back. Then they hated she produced theatrical productions based on what she learned, and they fought her every step of the way. Then they didn't want her to do this documentary, but over time, they began to realize that she heard their concerns, and even when she continued to tell the story she felt was worth telling, because she actually brought honor to them, and now, they want featured roles in her projects. Go figure, she says. As for the external challenges with documentation, some are easier than others, but if you don't have the information you need to confirm them, then nothing you find will be of help to you. By the end of this episode, you'll learn how to search for documentation to prove your oral stories, as well as learning to look beyond the information that is presented to you online, because everything you see isn't exactly what it should be. The research for Mrs. Brown's family began with learning about a small country town in Alabama named Bullock County.
The first journey in time takes us back to the discovery of North America, a stolen land. We all learned in history class how Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue on his ship the Santa Maria and discovered the New World of North America in 1492. But when we research for ourselves, we discover the information told to us was an account that was not completely accurate. How can you discover a place that had life and existed long before you got there? So we must take this time to honor the Aboriginal Indians, the original Americans of North America. Alabama's earliest inhabitants were Indians whose occupancy spanned 10,000 years, at the time of initial European exploration in the 16th century. The primary resident Indian groups were the Creeks, Choctaws, Cherokees and Chickasaws, and they are known as Paleo-Indians. During the time when Columbus discovered North America in 1492, the Indians had been living their lives and making a home here. They were thriving and creating communities that learned how to cultivate the land for their families and their descendants. They even worked to coexist with other nations and tribes, like the Blackfoots, the Muskogee, the Creeks, the Cheyenne, Chickasaw. Many traditions from Indians have been passed down from one generation to another within the African American community. Many individuals of Native American descent have adopted and passed down many customs and traditions which were parallel to that of the Creek and Cherokee Indian. Food and cooking. Creek women maintained a small garden plot for their family. Their main food supply, however, was grown in a much larger field which belonged to the entire town. Corn, beans, squash pumpkin, melons and wild fruits were plentiful. They dried meat, pumpkins, peaches and apples, and sweet corn was preserved by boiling it until tender. Then the kernels were cut off the cob. Corn was cooked with lye or mixed with ashes and beaten to make hominy grits or meal. Medicine and remedies. Customs medicine and remedies. Creek Indian doctor always faced the east in a special place to prepare medicine. He cared for physical illness and alleviated pain and emotional suffering caused by the loss of loved ones and other mental anxieties. Many were taught by their fathers, so each varied in his practice. They learned many songs and chants that were used while preparing medicine, and also learned how to use different herbs, leaves and roots. Creek doctors fasted time and time again and practiced purification at all times, for this was sacred, and he was very careful about when and where he went to look for the roots, herbs, and leaves. They used sassafras root, devil cherry string, toverco blossoms, mullein leaves, wild cherry bark, milkweed, red cedar, blackberry root, charred coals, red root, black root, dogwood, pine, willow, sumac, poke, corn, persimmon, ginseng weak, ash tree buds or back, and spider web for potions.
County.
Funerals. The body of the deceased was kept for 4 days before being taken to the burial ground. Its body was never left unattended. On the eve of the funeral day, an all-night wake service was held. If the person had been a Christian, then sermons, songs, and prayers were delivered for the deceased. On the morning of the funeral, grave diggers would begin very early. Family members would put the individual's favorite clothes and small amounts of food and tobacco in the casket. Creek parents would rub their hands over the face of the deceased, and then rub the faces of their children in order to keep them from grieving. Traditions of Black Creek Indian descendants. On the eve of the funeral day, an all-night wake service was held. If the person had been a Christian, then sermons, songs, and prayers were delivered for the deceased. At the end of the 4 days, the body was taken to Creek burial grounds to be lowered into the grave. On the morning of the funeral, grave diggers would begin very early. The Christian Creeks have eliminated most of their traditional burial customs, but still all-night services are now held in a church. These are just a few examples of how traditions are passed down from one generation to the next, without context of why our elders cared to continue them. We can lose sight of who we are as people and our past.
So let's reenact what the modern-day version of having Columbus discover your home, family, community and neighborhood in 2022 would look like. Let's say you've worked hard your whole life to locate a neighborhood, a community, and a place you can finally call home. After working hard and applying some elbow grease, you make the house a home. A place of your dreams in a neighborhood you love where your friends and family live in peace and harmony for your family and descendants to thrive. Until one day, a stranger comes knocking on your door and says,
"I think I want to make this my home. What you've done isn't good enough for me or to my liking, so you gotta go. Not now, but right now. By any means necessary."
History in America is not just the version that some want us to believe. America is a land where the history of all of its occupants should always be remembered, because if we forget, then we all lose sight of who we are as unique individuals. Good, bad, or indifferent.
Now, let's take a brief look at the difference between indentured slaves and what Americans created, which is chattel slavery. Slavery existed on a wide scale in ancient times and was viable around 1450, when it was introduced into the New World by the Portuguese. They were experienced explorers of the West African coast and originally purchased slaves from there to serve as agricultural workers at home. Africans were living in villages, city-states, to empires, and an outcome of war with other tribes if captured, was that the prisoners were indebted to them or considered indentured slaves. They owed a debt and it was paid off through unpaid labor over a period of years. However, their livelihood was taken care of in the process. From 1607 until 1788, the first 13 original colonies established in North America were Virginia, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maryland, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Delaware, North and South Carolina, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania and Georgia. The initial set of slaves brought to North America were indentured servants who worked on colonies and not states. Therefore, you would need to understand how probate, deeds, newspaper articles and point-of-sale records were recorded for the colonies and not the states from the period 1607 until they were admitted into the Union between 1787 and 1790. The number of black slaves in America did not immediately expand after the Dutch brought the first boatload to Jamestown in 1619. On February 2, 1638, the first American slave ship named Desire arrived in Massachusetts, and around 1641, Massachusetts legalized slavery. Over time, opposition to the slave trade developed early, particularly among Quakers and Mennonites. The Mennonites in Pennsylvania passed a resolution against slavery in 1688, the earliest known anti-slavery protest in the colonies. It was only after the advent of the plantation system, with its need for dependable laborers capable of performing arduous labor over a long growing season, that the number of slaves grew rapidly. Tobacco, rice and indigo production became profitable. This map shows the volume of ships traveling from Africa to South and North America transporting slaves during the slave trade. According to this map, 8,000 slaves were transported to the Gulf Coast, 72,000 to the Carolinas, Georgia, 7,000 to Chesapeake Bay, and 24,000 to northern U.S. So not every slave during the transatlantic slave trade came here to North America, but more than enough were, and their treatment was deplorable. Between 1650 and 1860, from Senegal, Sierra Leone, slave trade regions on the slave coast of Africa and Congo, 4.5 million slaves were transported to the West Indies, and of that 4.5 million, 3 million were traded to North America to ports in Mexico City, New Orleans, Charleston and Richmond. According to this map, the map for transporting slaves from Africa to North America went from the following ports: Senegambia, Sierra Leone, Congo, Angola, Mozambique. If you follow the red arrows which show the path for the transatlantic slave trade, you'll notice slaves were not just transported to North America. There were 8 principal areas or regions used by Europeans to buy and ship slaves to the Western Hemisphere. The number of enslaved people sold to the New World varied throughout the slave trade. As for the distribution of slaves from regions of activity, certain areas produced far more enslaved people than others. The American Revolution, which took place between 1765 and 1783, was a successful revolt of 13 British colonies in North America against the British Empire. It ended with Britain officially recognizing the independence of the colonies and the formation of the United States of America. This would go on to have a major international impact, starting a wave of revolutions known as the Atlantic Revolutions. Domestically, the American Revolution would lead to major changes affecting the life of most American citizens, including African Americans, women and Native Americans. Slavery was abolished in the northern states.
Now let's look at the statehood of America, the territorial growth of the 13 colonies. Newport, Rhode Island, was one of the busiest ports of the slave trade. The merchants of the small colony, lacking the agricultural advantages of other areas, found it difficult to develop a dependable product for export. Virginia in 1790 included what is now known as West Virginia, so you would have to know where the slaveholder was actually living at the time of your research because the boundary lines changed over time. As we're ending the period of the 1700s, let's take a look at 1790 to 1790. Newport, Rhode Island, was one of the busiest ports of the slave trade. The merchants of the small colony, lacking the agricultural advantages of other areas, found it difficult to develop a dependable product for export. However, they found a ready market for rum. Rather than ship their liquor to European ports, they found it more profitable to take the rum directly to West Africa, where it was exchanged for slaves. The human cargo, in turn, was taken to the southern colonies and exchanged for sugar and gold. The beginning of the 19th century, 1800 to 1809. By 1800, there were about 900,000 slaves in the United States. Fewer than 40,000 of them lived in the North. Slaves provided free labor to those who owned them. The increased demand and prices for cotton led to plantations owners to search for land in the West. The invention of cotton gin in 1793 allowed for much greater productivity than the manual separation of cotton. The result was an explosive growth in demand of slaves for cotton cultivation. Slave trade had become a major economic activity in the South. French Louisiana already had sugarcane plantations, and after the 1803 purchase, Americans rushed to establish their own plantations and profit from free labor that slaves provided. The acquisition of the Louisiana territories, known as the Louisiana Purchase, in 1803 by the Jefferson administration doubled the size of the American territory and therefore its availability to the spread of slavery. The North and South had opposing views. The South supported the spread of the institution of slavery to the new territories while the North strongly opposed it. The Louisiana Purchase brought heated political debate to Congress. Upper Alabama was controlled by Georgia, but its inhabitants were Native American Indians. Lower Alabama was controlled by Mississippi Territory. Also in 1800, as the territories were admitted into the Union as a state, they may not have always had a census taken. By 1800 there were 21 states and territories, including Indian Territory, up from the 13 initially admitted into the Union. But only 8 had a census taken. Delaware, Georgia, Kentucky, Indian Territory, Mississippi Territory, New Jersey, Tennessee, and Virginia, which included what we now know today as West Virginia. March 3, 1807, President Thomas Jefferson signs into law the act prohibiting the importation of slaves. Then on January 1, 1808, the ban on the international slave trade goes into effect. Ship manifests were required at the ports to show proof that the slaves had not been imported after 1808. This is an image that shows how slaves were domestically transported here in the U.S. This knowledge can help researchers of slaves identify locations for major slave centers based on location of your ancestors and slaveholder information. These ship manifests contain detailed information about the shipowner and the slave. This is an example of the manifest record for domestic slave trade. 1810 to 1819. This was only the third census of the United States, and not all states were in the Union and had census records. Alabama and Georgia were a part of Mississippi, and still controlled by the Native American Indians. Georgia is still predominantly owned by the Creek and Cherokee Indians. For the counties that were forming, they were formed in Georgia, the territory, and not the state, therefore there were no census records for Georgia. In 1810, questions asked by the assistant U.S. Marshals was the same questions asked for the 1800 census. This census recorded the name of the county, parish, township, town, or city in which each family resided. Each family was listed by the name of the head of household and included the following: number of free white males and females aged, respectively. Under 10 years of age, of 10 years but under 16 years, of 16 years but under 26 years, of 26 years but under 45 years, 45 years and upward, number of all other free persons, and the number of slaves. According to Wikipedia, in the early 1800s, the United States government began a systematic effort to remove American Indian tribes from the Southeast. The Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, Seminole, and original Cherokee nations had been established as autonomous nations in the southeastern United States. This acculturation was originally proposed by George Washington and was well underway among the Cherokee and Choctaw by the turn of the 19th century. In an effort to assimilate with American culture, Indians were encouraged to convert to Christianity, learn to speak and read English, and adopt European-style economic practices such as the individual ownership of land and other property, including, in some instances, the ownership of African slaves. Thomas Jefferson's policy echoed Washington's proposition to respect the Indians' rights to their homelands, and allow the 5 tribes to remain east of the Mississippi provided that they adopt behavior and cultural practices that are compatible with those of other Americans. Jefferson encouraged practicing an agriculture-based society, and he sought to renew a policy of political and military action for the removal of the Indians from these lands and worked toward enacting a law for Indian removal. Jefferson encouraged practicing an agriculture-based society, and he sought to renew a policy of political and military action for the removal of the Indians from these lands and worked toward enacting a law for Indian removal. From June 18, 1812 to February 17, 1815, conflict fought between the United States and Great Britain over British violations of U.S. maritime rights. Tensions originated in long-standing differences over territorial expansion in North America and British support for Native American tribes who opposed U.S. colonial settlement in the Northwest Territory. During the War of 1812, General Andrew Jackson led his troops through enemy territory to victory in several tide-turning battles. In doing so, he greatly aided our nation's victory in the war, which led to the procurement of millions of acres in the present-day southern United States, including Florida. It ended with the exchange of ratifications of the Treaty of Ghent. Georgia is still predominantly owned by the Creek and Cherokee Indians. For the counties that were forming, they were formed in Georgia, the territory, and not the state, therefore there were no census records for Georgia. As a reward for their service in the Indian Wars between 1775 and 1855, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War, the federal government provided bounty land for those who served in the military and later as a reward for service.
1820 to 1829. For the fourth enumeration census of 1820, only the full name of the head of households was recorded along with identifiers for the number of people in the following categories: free white males, free white females, slaves both male and female but only their age, and free colored persons both male and female were recorded. Then in 1821, Covington County was created from Henry and Pike was created from Henry and Montgomery. Then in 1824, Montgomery gained additional land from Pike, so the families living in that area of Pike are now living in Montgomery. This is important because for the 1830 census, you might have to look for or there may be reference to property for both slave and probate records in both counties. Then in 1825, Dale County became a county of reference because of the land formation from Covington and Henry. Then in 1828, the western area of Pike gave land to Butler and the southern area of Pike gained land from Dale. For researching Pike County, once again, you have to look at where the slave owner lived to see where they bequeathed their property and if the recipient still lived in the area adjacent to Pike or Montgomery. Then in 1829, both Montgomery and Pike County gained Indian Territory and Pike also gained land from Butler and Covington. This was the land formation for the 1830 census. After the War of 1812, Georgia grew from Southerners acquiring land grants and migrating to the land that was taken from the Native Americas. By 1820, additional states joined the Union and may have had a census taken at this time. Missouri, 1818. Illinois, 1818. Michigan, 1818. Indiana, 1816. Mississippi, 1817. Louisiana, 1812. Alabama, 1819. And Florida ceded in 1819. 1830 to 1839. In 1830 a few more states were admitted into the Union. Missouri 1821. Florida was finally admitted in 1822 and Arkansas 1828. Now in Alabama in 1830, the Creek Indians were still in possession of part of the county, especially the areas close to Pike County and modern-day Macon, Barber and Bullock. Those counties weren't yet formed and they were Indian Territory. The 1830 census was the fifth U.S. census. Information recorded was as follows: name of head of family, address, number of free white males and females based on the identified age group. 100 years and older were identified. The number of deaf and dumb. The number of blind individuals. Foreigners not naturalized and the number of slaves and the free colored persons in 6 age groups. Then in 1830, Lowndes was created from Montgomery, Pike and Wilcox. The significance for this is the town lines changed right before the 1830 census, so individual living in the western area of Pike might be recorded in the 1830 census and not in Pike. Then in 1832, Barber County was created from Pike.
Tallapoosa from Montgomery and Macon and Russell was created from Montgomery County and Pike gained land from Montgomery.
And in 1837, Macon gained land from Pike, and Russell gained land from Macon, and for the next 29 years, the land in the Macon, Pike, Barber and Montgomery area didn't change significantly for the 1840, 1850 and 1860 census. As settlers were encroaching on Indian lands, and others wanted more land made available to the settlers, the Native Americans were losing possession of their land over in Georgia like that of Alabama. The Trail of Tears. According to Wikipedia, the Trail of Tears was part of the Indian removal and ethnic forced displacements of approximately 60,000 Native Americans of the 5 civilized tribes between 1830 and 1850 by the United States government. Members of the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Muskogee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations, including thousands of their black slaves, were forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands in the southeastern United States to areas to the west of the Mississippi River that had been designated Indian Territory. By a treaty of March 24, 1832, the Creek Indians ceded to the United States all of their land east of the Mississippi River. In 1833, Benjamin S. Parsons and Thomas J. Abbott prepared a census of Creek Indian heads of families, before they were removed from the land, which recorded their names, and the number of males, females, and slaves in each family. The entries were arranged by town and numbered. These numbers were used for identification in later records. The forced relocations were carried out by government authorities after the passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830. In Mississippi, areas were designated for each tribe. The Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek and Seminole and the Cherokee each traveled to the designated area for their tribe. The Cherokee removal in 1838, the last forced removal east of the Mississippi, was brought on by the discovery of gold near Dahlonega, Georgia, in 1828, resulting in the Georgia Gold Rush. The relocated people suffered from exposure, disease, and starvation while en route to their newly designated Indian Reserve. Thousands died from disease before reaching their destinations or shortly after. 1840 to 1849. In 1840, the following states were either in the Union or had a census taken for many of their counties: Wisconsin Territory 1836, Arizona 1836, Montana 1837, Michigan 1837, and Iowa Territory 1838. The 1846 U.S. Census was the first that attempted to count Americans who were insane or idiotic, with additional questions that were asked like, individuals 100 years and older, number of deaf and dumb, by race, number of blind, by race, number of insane and idiotic in public or private charge, by race, number of white persons over 20 who could not read and write, number of pensioners for revolutionary or military service, number of slaves 6 age groups and free colored persons in 6 age groups. Slavery and slave revolt. Today in 2022, many young people have been disconnected from the struggles our forefathers and foremothers endured. It's difficult to understand the lengths some people will go through to control, belittle, and mistreat another person just because of the color of their skin if you haven't witnessed or experienced it for yourself. Let's take a step back and put ourselves in their shoes. Imagine you're in bondage by someone who's forcing you to work and have children just for their benefit and financial gain. What would you do? Many resisted slavery in a variety of ways, differing in intensity and methodology. Among the less obvious methods of resistance were actions such as feigning illness, working slowly, producing shoddy work, and misplacing or damaging tools and equipment. So just imagine having a bounty put on your head because you decided to escape the bondage that others tried to inflict upon can truly be unimaginable to those of us separated by over 150 plus years since the emancipation of
I just can't take it anymore. First chance I get, I was gonna plan my escape to free. Hiding behind every brush, branch, and trees I could find. By hook or by crook, take my chance to move myself from dumb massa who think he's better than us just 'cause they white and we's niggers. They say, seek and ye shall find. Knock and the door shall open to you. So I just hold on to them their words they say is praying that there's Bible hope. 'Cause as sure as I'm a nigger, I know I got to be on the lookout for that there sheriff and the bounty hunters and them patty rollers who be on them roads looking for runaway slaves. All I know is with God on my side, I just got to be free. I just got to be free. 'Cause they tell me them stories about that woman named Moses who done it plenty of times. Then there was one about that fella named Nat Turner. They give you the courage to do it too. They also say there's white folks called abolitionists willing to help niggas like me get to freedom. I just pray God orders my steps and I runs into one, 'cause not every nigga who escaped got away, you know. So I just praise the Lord I be one of them. 'Cause the only difference in the slave master and me is the color of our skin. That's the only difference. That's it. What would you do to be treated equal with others? To be treated as a human being and not in a humane way.
1850 to 1859. Throughout the early 19th century, African Americans were a substantial minority of inhabitants of the United States. 15 to 18% of the total population were free or enslaved black people. In 1800, there were about 1 million black people living in the country. 893,041, and the number of free people of color was 108,395. By 1850, that number had practically quadrupled to about 3.6 million. 3,204,313 were enslaved African Americans and 434,495 free people of color. Based on these statistics, the number of free people of color dramatically decreased in ratio to the number of slaves from 1800 to 1850. For the 1857 census of the U.S., the identified states were admitted into the Union or identified a census for select counties. And the boundary lines for what would eventually become Bullock County was shaping into the counties we know today. Macon, Barber, Montgomery, and Pike counties. The 1857 census was the first census to have a free schedule and a slave schedule which recorded slaveholders with their slaves. This information was also captured for the 1868 census. For researching slave records, first, you locate the slaveholder and his family on the free census. Key indicators to look at are where they were born, their age, and their occupation. Also pay close attention to where their children were born. This will help you identify their migration pattern and possibly where they might have acquired any slaves along the way. Also, note, when you compare where individuals were recorded on the free census, they are 9 times out of 10 next door to one another on the slave census, provided they own, manage, or have hired slaves for the year. Not every person on the slave census actually owned the slaves. Many times they were managing them, if the slaveholder lived in another location, or they hired them for the year. Notes recorded the agreed upon terms of the hire. Next, you locate them on the slave census. Information recorded was the name of the slaveholder, whether the slave was a fugitive from the state, meaning if the slave had fled and not returned, number manumitted or freed, whether deaf and dumb, blind, insane, or idiotic, and number of slave houses they owned. This helps you to identify the location your family member could have lived,
especially if the slaveholder owned a few slave houses.
An interesting find for the researcher was when she noticed that for Pike County, Alabama, 9 out of 10 mulatto slaves were noted as a fugitive. Not every person on both the free census owned slaves and not every person on the slave census owned the slaves recorded by their name. Many times they were managing the slaves, because the slaveholder owned land there but lived in another location, or they hired them for the year and a note or an IOU was recorded. Mortality schedules record deaths in the year preceding the taking of the census. For example, the 1850 mortality schedules include persons who died between June 1, 1849 and May 31, 1850. Because death records were not required until the late 1800s, a mortality schedule can be the only death record available. These schedules may be the only record of death for some individuals, as many states did not require recording of deaths until the late 19th century, and many slaves who died before 1870 may be recorded on the mortality schedules, but you would have to search for them while directly viewing the schedule because they are not recorded by name, they are recorded by slaveholder name. Therefore, if you search for them online, you might not find your ancestor. Dropsy or dropsy is an old term for the swelling of soft tissues due to the accumulation of excess water. In years gone by, a person might have been said to have dropsy. Today one would be more descriptive and specify the cause to be edema due to congestive heart failure. Edema is often more prominent in the lower legs and feet toward the end of the day as a result of pooling of fluid from the upright position usually maintained during the day. Upon awakening from sleeping, people can have swelling around the eyes referred to as periorbital edema. It's helpful to understand the meaning behind many of the terms identified for that era. 1860 to 1869, War between the states, and the emancipation of the slaves. By 1860, the United States was in control or total possession of most of the land in North America except the area that was designated as Indian Territory. Let's compare the statistics of slaves from 1790 to 1860. In 1790 there were 700,000 slaves in the U.S., which was approximately 18% of the population. By 1860, there were 4.4 million African Americans in the U.S. before the war. With almost 4 million of them were slaves and 5 million were free. That means at least 89% of African Americans in America were slaves. By 1860, many of the counties near Montgomery, Macon, Pike and Barber did not have significant boundary lines changes. In Macon and Montgomery, the slave population was greater than the white population. In Barber County, the ratio was 50%, and in Pike County, the population was more white and slaves. Railroads bought and sold slaves with contracts and elaborate, printed bills of sale. They recorded these events in balance sheets and company account books. Railroads also developed forms for contracts to hire enslaved labor from slaveholders, because the company was liable for the loss of enslaved property. Contracts often spelled out detailed provisions for accidents and the conditions of labor. Southern railroad companies began buying slaves as early as the 1840s and used enslaved labor almost exclusively to construction their lines. Thousands of African Americans worked on the Southern railroads in the 1850s. For African Americans, the work was often the hardest, most difficult, and dangerous they were forced to undertake. Before the Civil War, the practice of slavery in the United States was one of the key political issues of the 19th century. Decades of political unrest over slavery led up to the Civil War. Disunion came after Abraham Lincoln won the 1860. On the eve of the Civil War in 1860, 4 million of the 32 million Americans were enslaved black people, almost all in the South. Blue-colored states indicate the Northern Union states. Light blue represents 5 Union states that permitted slavery. Red represents Southern seceded states in rebellion, also known as the Confederate States of America. And the uncolored areas were U.S. territories, with the exception of the Indian Territory later became Oklahoma. The government of the United States, the Union, rejected the claims of secession and considered the Confederacy illegally founded. The Confederate States dollar was first issued just before the outbreak of the American Civil War by the newly formed Confederacy. It was not backed by hard assets, but simply by a promise to pay the bearer after the war, on the prospect of Southern victory and independence. As the Civil War progressed and victory for the South seemed less and less likely, its value declined. After the Confederacy's defeat, its money had no value, and both individuals and banks lost large sums. During the war. On July 31, 1861, as it was published in the newspaper, "Look out, it is very important at the present time for our citizens to keep a sharp watch over the slaves of the county. There is no knowing what is brewing among them. Almost every one knows something of the difficulty that it is going on and has vague ideas as to the cause of it. Some no doubt suppose that old Abe is really coming south, having heard white men speaking in a jesting manner about his threatened visit to Richmond or Montgomery, and now men leaving our own part of this county and every one speaking of that Lincoln is really a dancing to Montgomery. There can be nothing wrong in taking care. Men will cause some Negroes to feel a degree of importance, independence, and obedient in the presence of his master, may in his absence become the most turbulent and disobedient. Add to this the knowledge of the Negro, for they are close observers of the movements and diligence of white men, that a careful watch or superintendence is not kept over them, and the probability of disobedience and turbulence is increased. Whereas if they discover that a sharp lookout is kept over them, they will be afraid to attempt or do many things they otherwise would do. We would not become alarmists, but we wish to recall the knowledge of one's existence has a great influence on the slave. To keep him in his place, in some parts of the county, not even these are in existence. Every man should strictly superintend his own premises during the present time. A little neglect might be the cause of much trouble. Let our citizens then look out. The Confederate States of America, commonly referred to as the Confederacy, was an unrecognized country in North America that existed from 1861 to 1865. The Confederacy was originally formed by 7 secessionist slave-holding states: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. In the lower South region of the United States, whose economy was heavily dependent upon agriculture, particularly cotton, and a plantation system that relied upon slave labor. Each state declared its secession from the United States, which became known as the Union during the ensuing Civil War. following the November 1860 election of Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln to the U.S. presidency on a platform which opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. Before Lincoln took office in March, a new Confederate government was established in February 1861, which was considered illegal by the government of the United States. States volunteered militia units and the new government hastened to form its own Confederate States Army from scratch practically overnight. After the American Civil War began in April, 4 slave states of the Upper South, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, also declared their secession and joined the Confederacy. The Confederacy later accepted Missouri and Kentucky as members, although neither officially declared secession nor were they ever largely controlled by Confederate forces. Confederate shadow governments attempted to control the 2 states but were later exiled from them. On Friday, October 7, 1864, the Troy Messenger published an article that listed a reassessment of the value of slaves for which under the existing law stated the following. The significance of this reassessment was the fact that the value of slaves significantly increased with the ensuing war between the states and slave owners desiring to significantly inflate the value of their property. The Civil War effectively ended on April 9, 1865, when Confederate General Lee surrendered to Union General Grant at the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse. After Lee abandoned Petersburg and Richmond, Confederate generals throughout the Confederate Army followed suit. By the end of the war, much of the South's infrastructure was destroyed, especially its railroads. The Confederacy collapsed, slavery was abolished, and 4 million enslaved black people were freed. The war-torn nation then entered the Reconstruction era in a partially successful attempt to rebuild the country and grant civil rights to freed slaves. The area comprising present-day Bullock County belonged to the Creek Indians until the Treaty of Fort Jackson ceded the western half of it to the federal government. About 20 years after the Fort Jackson Treaty, the Casita Treaty gave Alabama the eastern half of the territory that was to make up Bullock County. It was in the section that there was an Indian village Chonanagi, from which comes the later important village of Chunenagi. After the close of the war between the states, at the eve of the Reconstruction, by 1866, dwelling houses and farms were dilapidated and in need of repair. The bad conditions of roads was one reason that people demanded the creation of a new county, because during rainy seasons, they were practically isolated from the sites of the counties in which they lived. Those citizens of the northern part of the county, because of the character of the prairie soil, could hardly get to Tuskegee. Roads to Montgomery and Troy and Clarendon were as bad. The economic systems was unstable because it depended on what the Negroes would do. On December 25, 1866, the Alabama legislature approved an act to create a new county. The territory was to be taken from the southern part of Macon County, the eastern part of Montgomery County, the western part of Barber County, and the northern part of Pike County. The population created another problem. Military activities are not calculated to make philosophers or farmers of men, and the education of the boys had not been very utilitarian. They had studied law, music, public speaking, etc., and they had spent much of their time in sports, such as fox hunting, quail shooting, and horse racing. They had made good soldiers, but when their social system was destroyed and when they were placed on their own, they proved to be unstable. The population of the county at the time of its creation was about 25,000. Of this total amount, 7,223 were whites, and 17,251 were Negroes. Because Negroes substantially outnumbered whites in the county, over the years. When it came time to include the Negro in the voting process, committees were formed to investigate issues of fraud. At High Log, ballots were handed through a boarded window and the voter did not know. At Union Church, votes were actually changed and destroyed.
A body of riled Negroes who had been refused the right to vote at another place
Marched to the polls at
This project was produced to highlight the challenges researchers face when trying to locate their lost ancestors during the years of slavery. The following are the tips you can use to develop enhanced researching techniques based on the information shared in this episode of Look Where He Brought Me From: Finding Lost Ancestors Due to Slavery. For researching your slavery ancestors, there are many tools that are essential in order for you to find many of your ancestors who were sold away during slavery. Other than oral accounts passed down from one generation to the next, you will have to research probate records, which can be found in the county office for each state. There are many different types of documents that can be found in the probate office, but the items identified in red text are essential for the medium to advance researcher.
Wills and estate records along with the inventories and appraisements of the property of the deceased will help you identify who slaves were given to within the family as well as an account of others who purchased the slaves outside of the family. Also, when slaves were bequeathed to the children and other family members of the slaveholder, those recipients could have lived in an adjacent county or even another state, so it is very important to know the slaveholder's family so that you can properly track where the slaves could have gone. Deeds are bills of sale, deeds of gift, wills, and other documents that record the transfer of ownership of enslaved people. Deeds were written when individuals got married, when someone owed someone a debt, and when someone sold slaves to someone else. This example represents a couple who got married and they filed a deed where he gave his slaves to his wife upon his death, and she gave her slaves to her husband upon her death. This is how many slaves transferred from one spouse to the other outside of an identified will. The document says the following. This agreement made and entered into this 26th day of January 1834, between Patrick Burke, and Anne Percy, of the other part witnesseth, the said parties being about the intermarry, the said Patrick hereby agrees, if he should survive the said Anne, to relinquish and forever quit claim, after the death of said Anne, all right or interest that he may, or might have, or acquire in the event of the death of the said Anne as her husband and heir at law to 3 certain Negro slaves to wit, Grace, Simon, and Adam, and the said Anne hereby agrees in the event that if she should survive the said Patrick, to release, and forever quit claim to all right or interest which she may, or might have as the widow of the said Patrick, to 5 certain slaves now the property of the said Patrick to wit, Sylvia, Lucinda, Byrne, Abram, Caroline and their future increase in witness whereof, the parties to this presence have hereunto set their hands and seals the day and year above written.
Summary by the researcher, Mrs. Delbra Brown. When I started researching my family, the internet was in its infancy, and for African American researchers, there were no instructions or how-to guides available. I put one foot in front of the other, and now after 30 plus years of researching, I have been able to locate many of my ancestors, while at the same time, I continue to do the work so that I can continue to find many more. This series was put together with the prayer and the hope that it is a blessing to those who have a heart to try, and it provides some insight for those who have brick walls in their research. The following are some rules to keep in mind. Rule number 1, gather as much information as you can through oral, conversation, obituaries, photos, and newspaper articles about your family from relatives, loved ones, and friends. Rule number 2, after you've gathered all of your research notes, rule number 2 is to become very familiar with the state, county, city, or town of your research. Know the history of your location and be sure you have the facts based on the timeline for your research. Rule number 3, after you've gathered all of your research notes, the next step is to use the United States Census and many of the free online resources available to research and confirm their oral accounts. This is a great way to get started and to connect the dots. Remember to be sure to make a note of the dates you are researching and the actual location for that area based on the period of your research. Knowing this information in advance will enhance and improve your ability to find the information you're looking for. Rule number 4, in order to effectively locate your enslaved loved ones, you must learn everything you can about the slaveholder and their descendants so that you can identify deaths and locations to effectively conduct probate research. Rule number 5, with information about the slaveholder's family, research appropriate probate records. Keep in mind that the availability of research records varied from one state and county to the next, depending on the record and the date of your research. In order to effectively research probate records, being prepared with these types of information will also improve your ability to find your loved ones. Rule number 6, with the advancement of technology in DNA, finding family members through DNA research can be a blessing and a curse at the same time. Individuals noted as relatives may not understand how and may not have gathered a great deal of information about the family. Another challenge is that non-family members are researching or managing the DNA results of your family members, and they may not have any details that can help further your research. And lastly, not everyone cares to know or to research slave history, so they may not be willing to assist you. In closing, just remember, our ancestors gave their lives so that we can have a better life. How can we justly fight for the rights of others today without having intimate knowledge about the experiences of our loved ones who did the same for us and who paved the way just so that we can have a better today than they had yesterday? Why must we not forget? Because even though our opportunities have improved over the years, since 1965 with the Civil Rights Movement, so that we can, on some level, provide a better life for the generations to come after us. However, in order for us to continue to enjoy the benefits and perks of having, and for some even attempting, to have financial freedom, we can never forget those who made it all possible. Because if we make a conscious choice not to care about our elders and our ancestors, the ability to have equal opportunities in all areas and facets of our lives can be taken away at a moment's notice by the stroke of a pen or an attack on the very thing America stood for, democracy. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, D.A. Brown Consulting, for the premiere of Look Where He Brought Me From. Thanks for watching.